All right, we'll go ahead and do the AP FRQs on page 30 through 32. So this first one actually is an old review problem. It's about experimental design. The treatments of this are so to answer the first question, the treatments are the different garlic oil concentrations. The experimental units are the birds. Those in particular, it gives about the specific European starlings, however many those were. And then the response that's being measured is the number of food granules that those starlings consumed. So if we take a look at the grading guidelines, we see that they said the treatments are those different concentrations of garlic food granules. Now see, look, I should have said specifically 0 to 10 and 25%. The experimental units are those European starlings. And then the response is the number of, see, you will be measuring. What are you going to measure from each bird? You're going to measure the number. I think you actually even got marked off if you put average. And so let's take a look at this. If I remember correctly, yes, look, in subpart 3, it is not correct to identify the response as the average, because what do you measure from each bird? You measure the number of granules that they ate. And then after you measure each bird's granules, then you get that average. Okay? So it was the number. All right, now then you are supposed to go onto the top of the next page and you were graph this. So I saw lots of people seeing that it was going to be a scatter plot, and that was good. The key was had issues with what your axes were and what you labeled them. So here's what this should have looked like. You should have had the garlic concentrations on the x-axis, and then the response was how much was consumed. So you would have 0. Okay, and then you have to remember, draw this to scale. So you had to draw this out here, putting your 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, or whatever it was. You cannot just put the amounts equally spaced out. So make sure it was drawn to scale and labeled. And same thing over here on the side, drawn to scale and labeled. And then you have those points. So they expected that you had the correct axes, you had the correct labels, and of course the correct dots. And then the second question asking about the appropriateness of the pattern, you can see that it is a curved pattern, and so a linear model is not appropriate for modeling this situation. Just FYI, they did accept if you graphed a scatter plot or the residual plot. So if you did the residual plot instead, that would be acceptable as well. Any of these things would give you an incorrect graph. If you did not use the correct scaling, if you just put the numbers out equally spaced, and you didn't do correct scale, then that would be wrong. If you reversed the axes and you put the response on the x-axis, if you are missing the labels, or if you did something else, a histogram or a bar graph, you had to do that scatter plot to get credit. So in order to get credit, you had to have a correct graph with all the correct labels and scales, and then stated that it does not appear to be linear based on the results of your graph. All right, so you can see how you got your points on that. Now back to the other part. Let's go ahead to that page 32. Let's see how that looks. Back to page 32. This one was one that is actually in our section we are doing now. So we had these buffer strips, and they were trying to reduce the amount of nitrogen or chemical runoff into the water. All right, so the first question was interpret the slope. So in order to get full credit on interpret the slope, you had to use context, and you had to talk about the predicted number, and of course, identifying the correct slope number. So you had to say for every 1 foot increase in the width of the buffer strip, for every 1 foot increase in the width of the buffer strip, and that's what it says here, for each additional foot that is added to the width of the buffer strip, the predicted nitrogen runoff, you are predicted to remove an additional 3.6 parts of nitrogen. Now, they use the word on average. We use the part you are predicted. Don't do both, just one or the other. For every 1 foot increase in the grass buffer strip, the predicted nitrogen removal increases by 3.6 parts per 100. All right, next question, part B. Would you be willing to use this model to predict the nitrogen removal for grass buffer strips between 0 and 30? And so we had already discussed that. If they took data for information from 5 to 15 feet, and so we know that that data in that section has whatever particular, that linear pattern, but we do not know what the pattern is going to look like in those other sections. So you would say, no, I would not feel comfortable predicting from 0 to 5 or outside of 15. You only feel comfortable from 5 to 15, not outside it because of extrapolation. Of course, you had to explain why or why not. I would have said because the pattern can change and it may not be linear in those outside areas. Here's what they actually said on the grading guidelines. They kept it at this. No, this is extrapolation beyond the range of data. I would argue that that's beyond the domain of the data, outside the X values. So you should not predict narrower than 5 feet or wider than 15 feet because they were not investigated. You could say again, because the pattern, the trend, or the function may change outside of that. This was a problem number 6, which is the investigative task on the AP exam. And what happens is they'll give you the first part of it, which is stuff that we should know how to do. And then from there on out, so parts C, D, and it even goes further, part E. Those parts are kind of take you outside of the box. And so I did not have you do those today. But in order to get credit for your 1 point, so 1 point of credit, which on a number 6, they're the most heavily weighted question, so you want that 1 point. You had to say the correct interpretation of the slope, and then you had to identify that this was extrapolation and that you should not be going outside, estimate or predicting outside of that area. And you had, of course, to use context in both of these situations. All right, so that is the end of pages 30 through 32 on our AP FRQs.